This is part 90 of jQuery tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss how to save jQuery model dialog data to a database table. Here is what we want to achieve. Notice here we have a database table. We want to retrieve data from this table and display that in a table on a web page, as you can see here. Below the table, we have a button which says Add New Employee. When we click that button, we want to display a modal pop-up like this. And within the modal pop-up, we have fields to capture first name, last name, and email. So once we provide the data, and when we click Create button, we want to save the data to this database table, and the pop-up should close automatically. On the other hand, if we click Cancel, the data should not be saved to the database table and the pop-up should close. So let's see how to achieve this. The first step here is to create this database table, which I have already done, and here is the create table script. And the next step is to create two stored procedures. The first stored procedure to insert employee. So we are providing first name, last name, and email values to the stored procedure, and this stored procedure is inserting those values into this employees table. The second stored procedure is to retrieve all employees from TBL employees table. Now let's flip to Visual Studio. Within our web.config file, I have a connection string that is pointing to our sample DB database. The next step is to add an employee class. So this employee class is going to correspond to this employees table. So let's go ahead and add a class file to our project. So we want to add a class file, and let's call this employee.cs, and this class is going to have 4 properties. In the interest of time, I have already typed the required code, so let's copy and paste it right here. So we have 4 public properties, all of them auto implemented. The next step is to add a web service to our project. So let's right click, add a new item, and we want to add a web service, and let's name this web service employee service. And this employee service is going to have 2 functions. The first function to save employee data. So I'm actually going to change the name of this function to save employee, and to this function we need to pass the employee object that we want to save. And this function is not going to return anything, it's just going to save the employee that we provide to it. And we want this web service to be called from script, so I'm going to uncomment this script service attribute. And inside this function, we're going to write some ADO.NET code. So let's go ahead and bring in the required ADO.NET namespaces. We need system.configuration, we need system.data, and system.data.SQL client. In the interest of time, I have already typed the required ADO.NET code, so let's go ahead and copy this code from our notepad and paste it within our save employee function. So this is straightforward ADO.NET code. First, we are reading the connection string from web.config file and storing it in this variable. Next, using that connection string, we are building a SQL connection object, and then we are building a SQL command object. We want this command object to execute this sp insert employee stored procedure. Since that is a stored procedure, we have to tell that to the command object. And then we are creating the parameters of the stored procedure. So we are creating an instance of the SQL parameter object. The name of the parameter is @firstname, so that's the name of the parameter. And the value for that parameter is coming from the first name property of the employee object. And along the same lines, we are creating last name parameter, email parameter, opening the connection, executing the non-query. Okay, so since it is an insert, we use the execute non-query function. Okay, so straightforward save employee function. I'm going to make a copy of this. So let's make a copy of this. We need another function to retrieve the employees from the database, and I'm going to call this get employees, and this function doesn't require any parameters because we are going to retrieve all the employees from the employees table. And the same idea, we are reading the connection string from web.config file, build the SQL command connection object, and then the command object. Now using this command object, we want to execute a different stored procedure, and that is sp-get employees. So let's paste that here, and that's a stored procedure. And this stored procedure does not have any parameters, so we can get rid of all these SQL parameter objects. And let's open the connection, and we want to use a different function. We are going to get some data back, so I'm going to use execute reader function, and this function is going to return us SQL data reader object. So let's call it RDR equals whatever we get back. While we are looping through each row within the data reader, what do we want to do? We want to construct an employee object and add it to the list. So first, let's go ahead and create a list of employee object. So list, let's call it employee, list employee equals new list of employee. So as we are looping through each row, we are going to construct an employee object, and we are going to populate each property. So employee.id equals reader object. Reader object has got id column, and we want to convert that to an integer. So convert.toInt32. Similarly, employee.firstname equals reader of first name, and we want to convert that to a string. We need to do the same thing for last name and email. So here the property name is going to be last name, and the column within the reader is going to be last name. Similarly here the property is going to be email, and within the reader the column is going to be email. So we have constructed the employee object. We want to add it to this list. So list employee dot add employee object. Alright, so within the list we have all the employee objects. We want to write that list employee object to the response stream. So let's serialize that to JavaScript object. So I'm going to use another namespace here. So let's bring in system.web.script.serialization. So within this namespace we have got a class called JavaScript serializer. So let's create an instance of that class. Let's call the instance JS, and this class has got serialize function, which is going to serialize the object to a JSON string. So let's pass list employee to that function, and whatever JSON string that we get back, we want to write that to the current context response stream. So context.response.write. Alright, so let's go ahead and quickly test our web service. So this web service should have two functions. So get employee, save employee. So get employees should return us the existing two rows that we have. So it's returning us two objects in a JSON string. Alright, so our web service is working. Now let's flip to our Visual Studio. Now the next step is to design our web page like this. So first we need this modal dialog. So to get that, so notice within the modal dialog we have got first name text box, last name text box, email and text box. I've got that layout using a table. So in the interest of time, I have already typed the required HTML for that table. So if you look at this HTML, it's straightforward. We have a table and several TRs. Within each TR we have got a single TD. So here we have first name, and in the second TR we have a text box for first name. Similarly, last name, text box for last name, email and text box for email. So let's copy this HTML and paste that on our web form. So I'm actually going to create a div element here. Let's give it an ID. Let's call it dialog. And inside this div element, I'm going to paste the HTML that we have copied. Okay? So this entire table is present inside the div element. And within our jQuery ready function, I'm going to find this div element using the jQuery ID selector. So let's create a variable. Let's call this dialog div, and let's use the jQuery ID selector and find the div element. Okay? And on this dialog div element, I'm going to call the jQuery UI dialog function. So let's save that, and when we view this web page, look at that, we get whatever we have in the div as a dialog. Okay, now another important thing to keep in mind is that we don't want this div to be popping up as soon as the page loads. Instead, we are going to have this add new employee button. When we click that button, that's when we want that to pop up. So what I'm going to do here is specify the options for our dialog function, which we discussed in our previous video session. So we don't want this to auto open, so I'm going to set auto open to false, and we want this to be a modal dialog, so I'm going to set modal to true. And if you look at this dialog here, notice we have two buttons, create and cancel. We want those buttons as well. So to get those buttons, I'm going to use the jQuery buttons option, that is the dialog buttons option. And here we are going to use a JavaScript object. So I'm going to specify key value pairs. So the key here is going to be create. So this text will be the text for the button. Okay, create. And the value is going to be a function. So when we click on this create button, this function will be called. We want another button, that is cancel. So let's specify another key value pair. So key is going to be cancel, and value is going to be another function. Okay, alright, now we need a button as well. So let's go ahead and place a button here. So I'm going to include an input element. Let's give it an ID. Let's call this btn add employee, and the value on the button is going to be add new employee, and the type of this is going to be button. Okay, so when we click this button, that's when we want this dialog to show up. So let's find this button by ID within our jQuery ready function. So let's copy that. So here I'm going to say find the button using the jQuery ID selector, and when we click the button, we want to open the dialog. So within the click event handler, I'm going to again find this dialog div dot, let's call the jQuery UI dialog function, and now we are going to specify that we want to open the div. Okay, so let's save all these changes, and let's go ahead and refresh our page. And look at this, we have add new employee. When we click that button, we get the dialog. And at the moment, notice when I click cancel or create, nothing happens. So when we click cancel, what do we want to do? We want the dialog to close. So I'm going to specify that code right here within this function. So again, I'm going to find that dialog div. So this is the variable which is pointing to our div element, and on that call the jQuery dialog function, and now we want to call close function, right? So let's save the changes and reload this one more time, and look at this, when we click cancel, now the dialog closes, but when we click create, nothing happens. Alright, another thing that we need to do is when the web page loads initially, we want to load the data from this database table in a table, right? We want to load that existing data. So we need a table here on the web page, and in the interest of time, I have already typed the required HTML for that table structure. So I'm going to copy that and paste it just above the button. Okay, so we have a table there. Let's include a break element between the table and the button element. Alright, now I'm actually going to write a function. So let's name the function load employees. So here I'm going to create a function. Let's call that load employees. So we are going to issue an AJAX request. So let's specify our Ajax options. So the first thing that we want to specify is our URL. So the URL that we want to call is this employee service. So let's copy the name of the employee service. So that's the URL, and within our employee service we have a function, and that function is get employees. So this is the function that we want to call. So that's the URL that we want to call, and we want to issue a post request. So let's specify the method as post, and the type of data that we are expecting back from the server is JSON data. And when the request successfully completes, we want to execute some code which is going to be part of this anonymous function. So what are we going to get back? We are going to get back a JSON array. So this data parameter is going to receive that JSON array. What do we want to do with that? We want to loop through each object that is present. So I'm going to use jQuery each function. So $data dot each, and we're going to associate a function. Okay, so what do we want to do? Now we have a table here, and if you look at this table, it has got this ID employees, and within the table we have a T head, and we have first name, last name, email headers, as you can see here. And then within the table we've got T body section. So to this T body section we have to build a table row with first name, last name, email values, and append every row, right? So first we have to find this table and its T body section. So what I'm going to do here within our load employees function is create a variable. Let's call it T body equals find the table by its ID. So the ID of the table is employees, and this table has T body section within it, so it's a child of this table. So what I'm going to do is find the table, and within that we have that T body section. Okay, so this variable is pointing to that T body section. So here we are using ancestor descendant syntax. Alright, so we have the T body there. Now I'm going to create another variable here as we are looping through, and I'm going to specify a tr here. Let's call it variable tr equals, let's create a tr, so opening and closing tr. Alright, now to this tr we want to build a td with first name, last name, email, and append it to tr. So I'm going to call tr.append, and what do we want to append? We want to append a td, and inside the td what do we want? We want first name from the JavaScript object, and we want to close the td. Okay, so basically we are iterating over each JavaScript object that's present in this data, and we know that object is going to have first name, last name, email properties because the employee object is serialized, and that employee object has got those properties, right? So this here refers to the item that we are currently iterating over, and we are retrieving first name of that. Similarly, we need to retrieve last name and email as well. So here the property name is going to be last name, and here the property name is going to be email. So we have constructed the tr. What do we need to do with that? We need to append that to this T body. So T body dot append, we want to append the tr that we have constructed. Alright, so this load employees function is going to load employees from the dbay. So this is a function when the document is ready, we want to call that function, so it's going to load the data that is already there. So I'm going to call that load employees function. Alright, so let's save our changes and let's go ahead and reload this. So now we get the table with the existing employees data. When we click add new employee, Look at that, we get a dialog. Now when we enter these details and when we click create, we want to save those details to the DB. So I'm going to write a function to save employee data. So within our jQuery ready function, I'm going to create another function. Let's actually make a copy of this, and I'm going to call this save employee. And what do we want to do here? We want to issue an AJAX request to save the employee object. So first of all, we need to construct that employee object which we want to pass to the server. So I'm going to call this emp equals, I'm going to create an empty JavaScript object, emp dot, it's going to have a property first name. And where are we going to get the first name from? We're going to get it from the text box. And if you look at the text box here on this page, which is capturing the first name, it has got an ID, and the ID is txt first name. Similarly, last name and email. So let's go ahead and retrieve the value from the text box. So txt first name is the name of the text box, and I'm going to use the val function of that to retrieve its value. Similarly, let's go ahead and specify last name and email. So last name and then email. So we want to retrieve last name from txt last name text box. Similarly, email from txt email. So this employee object now has the data that the user has entered. So now we want to issue an AJAX request. So that's the URL that we want to call, but the function is going to be save employee. And notice this function has an input parameter, right? So save employee is the name of the function that we want to call, and we are going to issue a post request. And we also want to specify the content type parameter, otherwise this is not going to work. So content type is going to be application /JSON, and char set equals UTF-8. Okay, so we specified that we are going to send JSON data to the server. So we need to serialize data to a JSON string. So data equals a JavaScript object, and I want to serialize this. So I'm going to include a string here. And if you remember, the save employee function has got a parameter employee, and the name of the parameter is employee. So employee. So to that, I'm going to use JSON.stringify function, and to this stringify function, I'm going to pass this employee object. So it's going to convert that object also to a string representation, and to that I'm going to append this closing bracket. Okay, so we are serializing the entire data that we want to send to the server. Okay, and that's it. When the request completes successfully, we want to call this function, but this time we are not going to get any data back, so I'm going to remove that data parameter from there. So when the request completes successfully, what do we want to do? We want to load the data from the server again, right? Whatever new row that we have added, we want to load it. And to load the data, we have this load employees function already defined. So I'm going to call that load employees. Alright, so, and we also want to close the dialog, right? So I'm going to call dialog div dot dialog jQuery UI function, and we want to call close function. Okay, alright, so let's save our changes and let's rerun this. Let's close the other tabs and let's click add employee. So let's pass John, Joe, let's say jj@test.com is the email, and when we click create, look at this, for some reason it's not working. Let's see why is that. So we have retrieved the data from the UI, and this is the URL that we want to call. We want to issue a post request, and the content type is application /JSON, character set equals UTF-8, and the data that we want to send to the server that's the name of the parameter, and we are stringifying the employee object, and to that we are finally concatenating the closing brace, and the type of data that we are expecting from the server is JSON. We are actually not getting any data back, so we may or may not have this. When the request successfully completes, we want to call load employees function, and we want to close the div element. So this should work. Now the reason why it is not working is because we have defined the function but we are not really calling it, right? So we want to call this function when we click the create button, right? So we already have a function there. So what I'm going to do is, instead of defining an anonymous function here, I'm going to specify that as the function that we want to call when the create button is clicked. Alright, so let's save our changes. Let's go ahead and run this one more time. Let's add a new employee, John Joe jj@test.com. Let's try this now. Click create, and look at that. It adds it, but look at why the rows are duplicated. That's basically because initially when the page loaded, we already have these 2 rows, and when we added that new employee, it's adding all those 3 rows again to the table. That means we'll have to clear the existing rows, and to do that, so I'm actually going to define a variable here. Let's call it variable, or let's specify that within our load function, right? So when we load employees, what do we want to do? We want to empty the rows from tbody. So I'm going to say tbody.empty. So that should solve the problem. Let's run this one more time. So let's enter an employee, ABC, a@a.com, and look at that. Now it doesn't duplicate the rows. Alright, now another thing here, look at that. When I click add employee again, it's retaining the old data, but for some reason, if you don't want that behavior, then you can actually clear those values. And to do that, I'm actually going to write another simple function. So let's call this function clear input fields. And if you look at these input fields, the first name, last name, and email text boxes, they're actually of type text, and they're present inside this div element with ID dialog. So I'm going to again use the ancestor descendant syntax. So what I'm going to do is, find all div elements with ID, find a div element with ID dialog, and within that div element we have input elements of type equals text. So find all input elements of type equals text that are nested inside a div element, and on that I'm going to call the val function, and I'm going to set that to an empty string. So pretty straightforward function. So I'm going to copy this function name, and where do we want to call this? We want to call this when we successfully create an employee. So when an employee is successfully created, this is the function that gets called. So clear the input fields, and similarly, even when I click cancel, I enter a couple of field values, and then when I click cancel, I don't want to retain those values. So when we click cancel, this anonymous function gets called. So in addition to closing the div, go ahead and clear the input fields as well, right? So let's save the changes, and look at this now. Let's go ahead and add an employee. Let's say test t@t.com, add the employee, and look at this. When I say add new employee, we lost the values, right? Similarly, for example, let's say test and test. When I cancel and when I click add new employee, look at that, we lose them again. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.